Talk 49.
You're listening to Full Stop, a magazine of short stories and more. I'm Nigel A. James. A very warm welcome to you. To begin this edition, we're going back to the very dark days of the Crusades. Prester John, a king from the East. It was the time of the First Crusades. Many Europeans believed in Prester John, a Christian king from the East. And Prester John's army was the most powerful of all. There was no one he couldn't defeat. No one could stand in his way. And just at that time, the retaking of Jerusalem was not going to plan. The infidels were proving hard to defeat. The Crusaders were not so good as believed. In fact, they were bad. An ally was badly needed. And so a messenger was sent to the east with a letter from the Pope. Prester John, Pope Alexander III believed, would be a friend he could count on. Two Christians together, and one common cause. But there was one very small problem. No one knew where Prester John lived. No one knew where to find him, and he had never been seen. Prester John was a mystery. And to make matters worse, the messenger never returned, and the Crusaders had to do the job on their own. But where was Prester John? The answer was easy. If it wasn't the Far East, then India was next on the list. But he wasn't there either, and the search was taken to Africa. But Prester John and his army were nowhere to be seen, and to this day they still haven't been found. Prester John was one of the greatest myths of all times. Many people believed it. The truth is that Prester John was thought up by Bishop Otto of Freising in the 12th century. The story the bishop invented was that Prester John was a descendant of one of the three wise kings mentioned in the Nativity story in the Bible. The rest of the story, the army, power, and so on, grew on its own. People like stories, and the stronger and bigger the better. Prester John was, and still is, one of the best stories of all times. Prester John, a king from the East. Apple crumble is a sweet enjoyed after meals all over the world. Audrey Bowles invented it. I called this story Crumble, Custard and Cream. Apple crumble is one of the few British dishes that really taste great. Everyone likes it. It can be eaten with custard and cream or taken just as it is. And this great British dish is a thing that happened by chance, and its story began just after the war. Audrey Bowles was just 17 at the time, and because there were no other jobs to be had, she was cooking school dinners for a living. And in those days, school dinners were things that everyone hated. Nobody liked them. They simply didn't taste nice. And then, one day, things suddenly changed. School dinners took a turn for the better, and all because Audrey Bowles forgot something important. The apple pie had been in the oven for more than an hour, when Audrey Bowles went white in the face. She even had to sit down. The milk, the eggs and the water were still on the table. She had forgotten to add them. Dry pastry. Oh no! What could she do? 300 hungry young children, and no apple pie. A disaster was looming. Quickly, Audrey Bowles took the apple pie out of the oven, but there was no smell of burning and no burnt apple pie. The dry apple pie had crumbled instead, and it was really quite nice, just a little too dry. And this was no problem. Hot runny custard was all that was needed, and Audrey's apple pie, which was now apple crumble, was an immediate success. The kids simply loved it. And this was the first time in the history of British school dinners that the kids wanted seconds. A great day for Britain. And word quickly spread. Soon apple crumble was being served on all the big ships that crossed the Atlantic, and of course on all major airlines as well. Everyone, everywhere, loved it. Sometimes it's the small people in life who contribute the most. They make people happy, and Audrey's mistake in the kitchen was the best thing that ever happened in Britain. The day the pie crumbled was the day that all children smiled. Great British cooking was up at the top, and all thanks to young Audrey Bowles. If she hadn't forgotten the eggs, milk and water, there would be no apple crumble, just apple pie. Audrey Bowles and her great apple crumble. Some journeys take longer than expected. Here's Bruno Hope's story. I called it Beneath a Roman Moon. It was 1945. Bruno Hope was walking home across Italy. He was joyful and happy. His war was behind him, and now the future was his once again. And his home in Vienna, although still far away, was getting closer and closer as each day went by. Soon his favourite beer would be flowing, and the schnitzels he loved would be sizzling again in the pan. Bruno Hope was on his way home, and even the smell of decay, where he was just passing through, seemed amazingly sweet. Bruno Hope's life couldn't be better. But then the partisans struck. The firing was heavy, and there was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. And then, after being hit, Bruno Hope fell to the ground, seriously injured. And then, with one of his shoulders completely destroyed, and his heart holding on for all it was worth, he passed out. And there, beneath a Roman moon, he lay, waiting to die, in a deepening pool of young crimson blood. But Bruno Hope's death was not meant to be. The doctors worked hard and did all that they could, but Bruno Hope's left shoulder and arm had been too badly hit to repair. There was nothing the doctors could do. But Bruno Hope knew better, and so it was that he went to work on himself. Bruno Hope began by lifting the lightest of weights, and then, by gradually increasing the load, his shoulder returned to full strength, and 18 months later, Bruno Hope was able to move and use his left shoulder again as if nothing had happened. Bruno Hope had fought and had won. And that's how Bruno Hope was. He always got up from his downs and never gave in to the meanings of others. His journey was not always easy, but thanks to the strength of a long-ago moon, Bruno Hope knew his own inner self always knew best. His strength was within him, not in the meanings of others. Life is a journey of risks and sometimes great danger, but Bruno Hope never stayed down. He always came back. And that's a thought for us all. Life is a journey of risks, and sometimes even great danger. But for some people, this is just par for the course, and when they go down, they come up again. And Bruno Hope was just such a person. Bruno Hope, under a Roman moon. It was a very cold night many years ago in Vienna. I was waiting for friends to go running. It was there I discovered this very sad story. Doris Callus and the Cats of the Forest. The winter was in, and the cold had gone through to the core. It was almost dark, and there at the edge of the forest was a woman, and what she was doing made me curious, and so I went over to see. Her name was Doris Callus, and she was filling lots of small bowls with food. And then, after just a few seconds, the cats came out of the forest. Not just a few, but many. And Doris Callus explained. Each year, hundreds of cats run away from their homes in Vienna, and for many, the Vienna woods become the perfect new home. And there they are happy. But not for long, for then comes the winter, and it is then that hunger sets in. And that's why Doris Callus goes to the woods every day in the winter. It's her way of helping the runaway cats. But as the winters continue, the number of cats arriving for supper becomes fewer and fewer. The cold and the dangers are often too much, and many runaway cats sadly die. And Doris Callus continued. She used to have a cat, and he too ran away. But that was a long time ago. And now, feeding the runaway cats is Doris's way of remembering him. And by helping the runaway cats, one or two may even find their way home in the spring. And Doris used to dream of her little cat coming home. But sadly, he stayed out in the cold. In those days, there was no one to help, and that's why Doris is special. The winter was in, and the cold had gone through to the core. And there were the cats enjoying a meal. Doris Callus is a lady of heart, and whatever the weather, she is there every day with her food and her bowls. And I'm sure, without her, there would be no little cats to come out of the forest. Doris Callus and the Cats of the Forest. I once met a lady from Devon. Her life was sewing, flowers, and art. Cottons and threads and beautiful flowers. We're saying hello to Fini V. Fini V lives in the sleepy little village of Turington, and she is very well known. Fini V is an artist. That is to say, her hobby is art, and everyone knows Fini V's work. Her art is not only unusual, but also unique. Fini V is what's known as a patchwork artist. Her materials are cottons and threads and flowery material, and from these simple ingredients come wonderful works of great beauty. To begin with, Fini V goes looking for suitable pieces of cloth. Her favourite hunting grounds are bring and buy sales, jumble sales, and shops that sell second-hand clothes. And Fini V always strikes lucky. She always finds what she wants. And home Fini V goes with a wonderful piece of flowery material. And then comes the act of creation. Fini V cuts up her newly found piece of flowery material into lots of small patches, and then sews them together again in no real order. A random creation. A piece of great art that's made for amazement. But however fantastic Fini V's pictures may be, there's always the question. Why does Fini V bother? Her pictures, after all, when finished, all look exactly the same as the material did before she cut out the shapes. The answer, of course, is Fini V's secret. And, as everyone knows, art is a question of taste. And Fini V's living room walls are the natural home for her wonderful works. And Mike, Fini V's husband, does all the framing and hanging. And there, on the flowery living room walls, Fini V's pictures all disappear. Flowers against flowers, they all look the same. Maybe Fini V should look for new patterns. But Fini V is a lady of flowers. She once was a hippie. Fini V is a lady of art. But whilst visiting for tea, you may be forgiven for believing she has no pictures at all. Flowers against flowers, and colours against colours, all very still lives. Fini V, cottons and threads, and beautiful flowers. Birds and people make very good friends. Here's a true story. It happened many years ago in the great park of Schönbrunn in Vienna. Birds of a feather. It was a very hot day in Vienna. I was sitting in the shade of a secluded corner in the park of Schönbrunn when a woman came into view. And she wasn't alone. She was being followed by an entourage of crows which was wobblingly walking behind her. And as she passed by, I told her she seemed to be a very popular woman. She smiled and said it was lunchtime, and that she daren't come to the park without a bag full of nuts. Crows, she explained, love nuts more than anything else. Then this unusual procession carried on round the corner. I was once again on my own, but not for too long. In fact, it took just a minute or two. One by one, the crows started returning the way they had come, but now in full flight, and each with a nut in its beak. It was a wonderful sight. And then came the woman again. She told me she had been coming to the park for more than 10 years and had rarely missed a day. Birds for her were a source of great joy, and this I fully understood. Watching the birds had given me great pleasure too. And all this great pleasure was thanks to a very hot day, the shade of a wonderful park, and the unexpected appearance of a little old lady. My wait in the heat had been worth every minute, and I too went happily on. It's time now for a very short essay. I've always found the idea of what's behind walls a fascinating subject. Listen to my thoughts. And now, here's a short essay that I wrote to keep thinking in place. I called it Walls. Walls have never failed to interest me. While still very young, I remember being fascinated by the thought of that which lay behind a very long brick wall which I passed on my way home every day after school. Unfortunately, I never did discover what it was, but I have never forgotten the wall. And then later on in life, I couldn't help wondering why Berlin needed a wall which ran bang through its middle. Walls, in a word, are a subject of interest. And walls come in many different shapes, lengths, sizes and heights. And all this has to do with the purpose for which they were built. And surprisingly, the number of reasons for putting up walls are, in fact, only two. Walls are either for keeping people or things in, or for keeping them out. And that's why walls are a very big part of our lives. All of us need them, and most of us want them. Walls are the guardians of our privacy. We need them to separate that which is ours from everyone else's, and the higher and stronger the better. And society, too, is walls within walls. Some are good, and some are bad, and many are necessary, and some are of no use at all. And our walls begin with ourselves. People build invisible walls around themselves so as to prevent others from getting too close, and others see walls around others which really aren't there at all. Walls are both real and imaginary. Prisons, of course, need walls to keep people in, and quite rightly so. But what about our borders which are there to keep people out? They too are walls, but of a different nature. Shouldn't boundaries be things of the past? We are, after all parts of the one same world. So which walls do we really need? There is a saying in America which says that good garden fences make very good neighbours. There's a lot of truth in this pocket-sized packet of wisdom, and the truth of this saying lies in the fact that there are people who are not happy with only that which is theirs. They want more. And the only way to prevent others from getting that which is yours is to build a wall to protect. So walls, at the end of the day, are all about angst. And history is packed full of examples of angst-inspired walls. The Great Wall of China, the Berlin Wall, the wall which separates the two sides in Israel, the Maginot Line which failed in the Second World War, and of course the wall, or fence as it is called, which stops Mexicans entering the United States of America. There are countless other examples as well. But most walls are really incapable of resisting the attempts of the determined. How many people escaped from East Berlin? Did the Maginot Line stop the Germans from invading France in the Second World War? How effective is the wall along the Mexican border? The point is that all walls have doors, and not all doors look like doors. Doors, just like walls, come in many forms. It all depends on the wall. The Berlin Wall allowed people to pass in a variety of ways. There were tunnels, ladders, disguises and cunning. A wall is only as strong as the imagination of he who erects it. But walls will always be needed, and that's because we are how we are, victims of angst. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. However strong and permanent a wall may seem to be, it will not stand forever. Walls are the products of our thinking, and thinking is stronger than even the biggest of walls. So if we stop thinking walls, then one day they might disappear. A world without national boundaries, a wonderful vision. But this vision too is being kept where it is by a very strong wall of old-fashioned and out-of-date thinking. Walls, I'm afraid, will stay with us forever. But maybe I'm wrong. As I said, thinking is stronger than walls, and the Berlin Wall disappeared too. Every wall on earth, however strong, will one day be part of our past, and life will go on as if they'd never existed. People quickly forget, and that's the weakness of walls. And now to finish with, we're going back to 1962, Washington, a swearing-in and a duchess. A duchess and a president. It was a very cold night. The Duchess of Devonshire was entering her thoughts in her diary. She and her husband were in Washington, guests of the Kennedy family. 20th of January 1961. Jack Kennedy's inauguration. The Duchess had had a very full day. The swearing-in at the Capitol, the march past at the White House, and the ball in the evening. A day of surprises, minor shocks, and a glimpse of a different society. The first surprise, a small shock for the Duchess, came at the White House, the actual swearing-in. Many people were completely ignoring the prayers, preferring instead moving around taking photos. But what happened during the march past at the White House was almost too much. Just as an Air Force unit was stiffly marching past, one of the airmen broke rank, stepped out of line, took a snap of the president, then fell back in line and carried on marching. There was more, and it came from the top. While all this was happening, the president was drinking coffee and eating chocolate biscuits. The president was trying to keep warm. But the ball in the evening was very much different. The Duchess was very impressed by everyone's willingness to speak to the press. Journalists in America were very respected people. But there was still one more lasting impression to come. The whole occasion had been a melting of rank. Whoever you were important. And the Duchess stopped writing and turned off the light. She'd had a very long day. She had seen the making of history. She had discovered great differences. Everyone was in with a chance. This was America. A duchess and a president. Some interesting differences. And that's it for this edition of Full Stop. Thank you for listening. I'll be back in December with some more short stories. I'm Nigel A. James.
Talk 49.